Hello, and welcome to The Nose, which we usually do on Fridays, but if you're listening live, then you're listening on Thursday. And I should say there's sort of a connection, too, to what we're about to talk about. Our company does observe Juneteenth as a company holiday, so we'll have a special on the air tomorrow in this spot that is connected to Juneteenth. And so is the first topic on the show today. We're going to talk about High on the Hog, a remarkable 4-part miniseries, docuseries, I guess they call them now, on Netflix. It is about the contributions and linkages between African food, the food created on plantations, and the food that is eaten all across America today. In the second part of the show, we're going to come back to last week's topic sooner than we expected to. In the Heights has now kind of attracted a kind of sub-controversy, a mini controversy, or maybe a maxi controversy. And it involves kind of, I mean, for want of a better word, the pigmentation of cast members and whether or not they're reflective of the predominantly Dominican Republic community in Washington Heights, a community, if you've been there, that's being nibbled away at by exactly the kind of gentrification that's dealt with in the movie and the play. Anyway, that is still to come, but let me tell you who's on the show. First of all, on the nose today is Rand Richards Cooper, a fiction writer, contributing editor at Commonweal, and restaurant critic for the Hartford Courant. Sean Murray is a stand-up comedian, writer, and the host of Nobody Asked Sean podcast. Before I throw it to the panel, I also want to say, just do a kind of a shout-out to my son. My son's the one who got me to watch this thing, and I don't really like food shows all that much. and he said, and he'd watched the whole 4-part thing, and we're sitting there, and he goes, "No, you really should watch this." And he got me to watch episode 3. Because he knew I would be specifically interested in that. And then I was hooked, and we went back and we did 1, 2, and 4. I don't really recommend doing them out of order, but and so thanks to him, he's now watched the whole thing all over again, just so that I would watch it with him. And he's right, at least I think so. It's really remarkable. But so Sean Murray, I think you, like me, around the time that we were agreeing that this would be a good topic, you'd already seen High on the Hog. And I don't know if you were trying to describe it to a friend, maybe for the purposes of interesting the friend in the series. What would you say about it?
I would say it's you describe it as, a look at the contributions of African Americans to American dining, but I think it's also a look at like the history of African Americans through dining, not just like what we've contributed to American dining, but like you can kind of tell the story of the African diaspora in America through our cooking, even in ways that like I wasn't aware of. Like, certain things you're going to pick up on just by being African American. But like there's a lot of stuff I learned in this show that I didn't even know before. Like I didn't even know how significant the rice crop was in like, I think it was Charleston.
Yes.
And like most of the early rich, wealthy people in America came from rice plantations, which was fascinating.
Right, raised plantations and a kind of agriculture that had been very specifically, almost literally transplanted from Africa. Yeah. So Rand, you're the food guy, and you're also somebody who's lived in Africa. I don't know. Just give us sort of your initial take. Let's say you were pitching this series to one of your friends. Here's why you should watch it. What would you say?
Well, I would say, first of all, that this series is going to speak to you personally. It's almost inevitably. It spoke to me personally, even though arguably in ways that are interesting. It's not primarily intended for me, but to me, it sparked very particular memories, a taste memory of a Southern restaurant. I've been bombarding you guys with stories about that, a restaurant in New York City that I loved in my young adulthood. That was a sort of aspirational restaurant for me. Memories of my mother, who had traveled to Low Country in South Carolina. She loved to cook, and she came back, and for years she cooked fish dalfuski, an island that is mentioned in the series. And I can just, my mother died 12 years ago. I can still hear her saying, "I'm making fish dalfuski." So for me, really, the concept in which I'd love to talk about this is food as memory. Memory is a very personal thing. And food can bring us back to our childhoods and families. Some of my favorite food writers, MFK Fisher, AJ Liebling, Edna Lewis, who I want to talk about later, they work this connection between food and memory and childhood. But the second part of this, and the other appeal that this series makes, is to memory more broadly construed, which is a collective thing, that the memory of a people, of an ethnicity. And, finally, there's the kind of official collective memory that's history. And that's where this documentary really engages in an interesting way, because history, as this documentary is very much aware, is something that you have to kind of make it into, or you risk being permanently forgotten. And I see the second part of this, not the second part in part 4, but the second mission of this. The first part is to present a bunch of great food, and I'd love us to be able to talk just about how scrumptious this thing is. But the second part represents a conscious effort to augment and correct a historical record whose memory is incomplete or defective. And so I think those are the 2 points for me. They both relate to memory, beautiful, beautiful food that appeals to every person, but then also a Black host speaking specifically with Black culinary practitioners in a project of cultural appreciation and restoration, really.
Yeah, we should talk about that host, because we've been talking about him getting ready for the show, too. Stephen Satterfield is a guy who really hasn't been in front of TV cameras much, if at all, before. He's a food writer. He's a former sommelier. He's got his own media company now. He actually was contacted about this show without realizing that they wanted to at least consider him as the host. He thought he was just being, consulted about stuff. And he brings... I think we were all struck by this, and I should just say, so I don't forget, that one of the first people you meet along with Satterfield is the other person who's really kind of at the heart of the show, Jessica B. Harris, who is the author of a book called High on the Hog: A Culinary Journey from Africa to America. It's the foundational text for the idea of this series. But Sean, Satterfield is interesting. I mean, he's like the anti-Bourdain or Stanley Tucci. He doesn't really play to the camera. He's a very kind of self-contained guy, I think, in a lot of ways, but he has a nice way, I think, of bouncing the spotlight onto the guests, the food, the place, and just kind of being a placeholder for us, maybe.
Absolutely, yeah. It sort of feels like he's aware of his limitations as a host. Like he knows he hasn't been in front of camera much before, so he's letting the story tell itself, letting the chefs and cooks and just the people he meets in Africa and here in America, like tell their stories rather than trying to like front load himself into the show, which is actually great because he does a good job of like, he's very dry and understated, which serves well, especially in like some of like the heavier like moments of like historical like reckoning or whatever. So it works, but like you said, he is sort of the anti-Bourdain, where it's like Bourdain, like he brings so much passion and like energy to his show. Where this show, I was having a conversation with someone. I was like, "This guy's super dry," and then the person was like, "This is probably what it needs, though." You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Maybe it doesn't need a Bourdain type of energy, which I could appreciate.
I think so. Before I get ran on this, I want to just let you hear a little bit of the voice of Stephen Satterfield. This is a little bit of kind of how he narrates.
I think a lot about food, how it connects us through time, across geography.
So good.
From generation to generation. It tells stories about where we've been, where we are, and where we're going.
Are you familiar with the phrase high on the hog?
Yes, I am.
Can you see it already smells like mac and cheese?
The truth is, a lot of American food has its roots in African American food, traditions, and ingenuity. I'm Stephen Satterfield. I'm a food writer who studied as a chef and worked as a sommelier for over a decade. And I'm on a journey to uncover the stories of African American food and meet the new generation preserving our history.
This one's off the Carolina gold rice. We've broken the rice down and made rice grits.
From the earliest days through the darkest decades of struggle, we persevere.
Despite the fact that we were in hell, we were suffering, somehow in all of that nonsense, we created a cuisine.
These are our stories.
So Rand, not only is Satterfield kind of our eyes and ears and nose in these situations, but he's very specifically our mouth in these situations too, in the sense that, we watch him eat stuff that he hasn't eaten before. We watch him savor it, and he kind of is our guide in that way too.
Right. It might be worthwhile to very quickly sketch in the four-part structure, because he has a lot to get through. The first takes place in Africa. He goes back to Benin, a major port of the slave trade, and he talks to people who are involved in restaurants and cooking there. The part two is a kind of corrective version of the culinary scene of our founding fathers, and focuses on two chefs, one the personal chef for Washington, the other for Jefferson, sort of a culinary correction of the founding father myth. Part three goes to the low country of South Carolina, the Gullah Island culture. Fascinating to me. That's the part that you started out with, and I've been very interested in that cooking and cuisine for a long time. And part four goes to Texas and sort of segues into Juneteenth, talks about barbecue, and takes an extensive sort of side trip into the history of the Black cowboy. Very fascinating. So he's got a lot to do, and he's economical in that way. He's patient. He struck me as unlike many chefs I know, because he's not opinionated. And as far as the tasting goes, a lot of the times I didn't feel we were typically getting like much of a trained chef perspective. He was more just like us, so the food on display is fabulous. And it is like, do not watch this show if you're hungry. My particular favorites was the one on Dafusky Island, where a young woman includes a chicken, she cooks chicken turnip greens and this hickory smoked beet cornbread, which is gorgeous. And then in the founding chef segment, he goes, I think, to Monticello, and they do this hearth cooking, and a chef there, a Black chef, makes a veal sweetbread with crab, mushrooms, and sherry cream sauce. And Stephen Satterfield, he tastes these dishes, and mostly he just says, "Oh my God, this is really good," and so that's what we would be saying. I at first found his ingenuousness, his earnestness to be not off-putting, but I sort of wanted more forceful presence from him. But I gradually was won over to the sense that no, this is actually kind of the optimal way to bring us into the very multifaceted experience that he has to cover.
Yeah, I could be wrong about this because I did watch it out of sequence, but I'm pretty sure it goes African roots, rice, then founding chefs, then Juneteenth and the Cowboys. But in any case, yeah, I mean, Sean, we should say something about this first episode. First of all, he's in Benin, but he's not even just in Benin. He's in this, I don't know, just like completely sort of magical place that's on it's like the Venice of Africa or something. It's sitting on water. And you go from place to place in canoes and little boats and stuff like that. But there's also this real, supreme moment of reckoning. It's really the time where Satterfield's composure breaks, as he spends some time kind of in this almost physical gateway to slavery. And it was a really, really powerful scene. I don't know what you made of it.
It was very powerful, and part of like the fact that he hasn't been on camera, initially it kind of rubbed me the wrong way, because it seemed like he was being, that was the one time I felt like he was being disingenuous. It felt like he needed to be super emotional. Like we were talking in the email about how he's sort of everything he says is sort of like, this is a very spiritual experience. And he had said that so many times before that by the time he said it at that scene, which is probably the most spiritual moment of the entire show, it almost felt disingenuous to me, but I could tell it was real. But he seemed like he felt like he needed to cry. But that moment was incredible, just being at like the point, like literally the point of no return for most slaves. Like they'd never come back to Africa. That's where they left from. And I thought it was amazing to like they had to remove their shoes and they were walking on it and just feeling like the history. A lot of people talk about stuff like that when they like, I can feel the history in this place. And like, that is one of the few times when someone says that when I actually believed it.
Oh, no, absolutely. And Rand, I know that you did relate quite a bit to that rice segment and to the Gullah Geechee culture. We also are actually introduced to the Geechee Gullah ring shouters, who I think appear on every single episode, or their singing appears in every single episode. But say a little bit more about what moved you about the rice segment.
Well, so along these lines, I would recommend for anyone who was interested in that segment in particular, there's a terrific film, a fictional film, feature film, 1990, I think, by a filmmaker named Julie Dash called Daughters of the Dusk. And it's a historical film set in the early part of the 20th century on those islands. And it's in part an ethnography of Gullah life. And she said, when describing that film, I wanted to do a film that was so deeply, and her family was originally from there. She said, I wanted to do a film that was so deeply embedded in this culture and so authentic that it felt like a foreign film. And when you watch Daughters of the Dusk, what got me about that film is the things that in passing create the sort of foreign country of the past. And a lot of those were things that she went back 100 years to show as continuities between Africa, that lost ancestral home, and the way people were living around 1900. Basket weaving, a boy with cheek scarification. We see that in one of Satterfield's hosts when he's in Benin. The use of mortar and pestle. In addition to rice, the other industry was indigo, and so we see indigo production. Guys playing this board game called mbao with stones and a series of cups set into a wooden board that's very prevalent in Africa. So this storytelling with dance and lots of food preparation is this conscious effort by a filmmaker in 1990 to reach back to a past, or an African-American past, already a century old, at a time when people themselves were struggling to remember further back into the midst of a place that they had been forcibly separated from. One of the things I loved about this series is we see through these juxtapositions continuities, some of which are culinary, some of which are cultural. They have there's a very long, extraordinary long segment of a Texas high school marching band toward the end. And a little bit you wonder, like, why are we seeing this much of the drum majors dancing? And then you realize that the juxtaposition of that with the African dancers that we've seen, is charting like this cultural echo. And that echo also happens in the food. The roots of gumbo are in the African word for okra. There are other foods that aren't mentioned, like the Puerto Rican dish mofongo, which comes from African fufu. So I think one thing I loved about that episode, and generally, is the way that the makers of this documentary, work hard to establish both the reality of and the importance of these cultural and culinary links to a deep cultural background. And that's part of what this project of restoration that goes on in this series.
Yeah, I do want to bring up, because it's awkward and I like awkward things, that probably the most famous American right now of Gullah extraction or Gullah past is Clarence Thomas, who I believe grew up speaking the Gullah tongue. I mean, maybe not the guy that we sort of like to associate with all these things, but there you have it. One of the things that I've been running into a lot lately, Sean, is something that Satterfield talks about in interviews, which is that he wanted to make, and he's pleased that High in the Hog is, a celebratory a moment. It's obviously it doesn't shirk the past. It doesn't ignore the past. But it's very much the story of beautiful people who. Well, I'll read his quote. He goes, "I want people to perceive it as celebratory. Oftentimes, when our shows get made, when our stories get told, when our food gets talked about, it's the hardship story. I don't even mean celebrating resilience. I mean, look at all these beautiful Black people moving uninhibited, unencumbered in a centuries-long tradition of how we convene, shape, culture, celebrate, make a living. This has always been part of our tradition as a diasporic people descending from the continent of Africa." And there's a way in which, I had just gotten through listening to Zarin Burnett's series Black Cowboys, where he basically says the same thing. It's that, he and his father brought him up saying, yes, it's important to know the slavery narrative, but it's also important not to get stuck in that. It's important to look at what happened afterwards, ways in which, people went forward and claimed their own destiny in different ways. And I do think, as we're going through this large, long, important national reckoning, that I'm hearing that more and more, particularly from Black creative people.
Yeah, it comes up a lot with a lot of Black people I speak to, and I just see online, and I totally understand it. But I think part of that, like the history of like a lot of our stories being told through trauma, is that those were the stories that were deemed important. Like for a long time, you couldn't, like, even up to a few years ago, like you couldn't really make a Black movie that like got like real critical recognition that didn't really deal with trauma. Like there's been stories and movies and shows out there that are celebratory, but it's usually the ones that are like treated as like Emmy worthy or Oscar worthy, or like Roots, or like 12 Years a Slave, or even Barry Jenkins' Underground Railroad. That's got a lot of critical acclaim. It's very few opportunities that Black people, I feel, have had throughout history to have something that feels important, but is also not necessarily about like, this is how hard it's been for us, but rather this is what it's like to be Black, or this is just like a day. That's why I love, like, Spike Lee gets a lot of love for Do the Right Thing, rightfully so, probably the best movie of the 20th century. But Spike Lee had a lot of like fun movies. He had School Days. He had I'm blanking right now on others, but his movies weren't all of that, but sometimes those are the ones that get respected. The Malcolm X's and which also should have won Denzel Washington Best Actor, but we'll get into that another time. I feel like I love to see it though. I love to see that something like High on the Hog is getting a lot of eyes on it, and it's not necessarily just the heaviness of that first episode. It's also stuff like even in the heaviness, the stuff about like Hercules and I can't remember Hemmings. I can't remember.
James Hemmings. It's Hercules.
James Hemmings.
Hercules Posey, I think, and James Hemmings are the two chefs of the presidents. Tell that story though.
Oh yes, those James Hemmings was the chef at Monticello. He was brought to France to learn how to cook like in the French brigade sort of system by Thomas Jefferson, and he came back and he taught even a lot of recipes, like sort of like macaroni and cheese is credited to him, dating back to his time at Monticello. And then Hercules was George Washington's chef at on I think it was on Martha's Vineyard or Mount Vernon, and a lot of Martha Washington's recipes, they believe that are actually recipes that Hercules created and or credited to Martha Washington, because of course they would be. But even in those stories like that, like there's a heaviness to it. Like James Hemmings had to teach his younger brother to cook as well as he could, so he can in order to have his freedom. But even in those stories, you have the celebration of like, wow, this guy, this slave created macaroni and cheese, one of the most beloved dishes in America right now. So it's like, or basically created it more or less. And that's amazing. So even in those moments where it's like some super, super heavy, or like Hercules like sneaking off of the plantation while there was a big party at George Washington's estate to get his freedom. It's like, that's sucks that it had to be that way, but it's amazing that this guy was able to escape to New York and live out his life, just being a chef in New York City. It's amazing. Right.
There's a little Papulian through line from this to the thing we're going to be talking about in just a few minutes, in the sense that George Washington, who gets very, very favorable treatment in Hamilton, doesn't get such favorable treatment here, and some things about him are made clear to me and in a way that I hadn't fully previously understood how vindictive he could be. So we're going to run out of time here, and there's so much more that I want to talk about, and I feel bad. But Rand, I mean, one of the things that's important to say is that although this series looks, yes, at the roots, to use the word, of the cooking, it also really goes into just high-end cuisine. High-end cuisine. It ends with this fabulous dinner in Houston, but all the way through, we're just watching these black chefs now who are doing just amazing things at beautiful, luxuriant-looking restaurants, and also being reminded that this didn't just happen in the last 10 or 20 years. This has been going on for a while. There were, there's a consistent history to this kind of cooking. But I don't know whether you want to tell the story of Jezebel, but I think we ought.
I will, only because it's, I think, a real point of Satterfield to make the point that you just made. And when he interviews that family of many generations of Black caterers in Philadelphia and shows how upscale their past was, 100 years ago, the notions like that are intended to, carve out a space for an understanding of Black history that many people, white and Black themselves, don't have. And a point along those lines is that, hey, Southern cooking is more than just like, really homey comfort food. And I recall when I was just out of college in the mid 80s, and I was living in New York and trying to be a writer, and I lived on 45th Street and I had no money at all. And there was a restaurant down the block at the corner of 45th and 9th called Jezebel. It was a Southern restaurant. And it was very upscale, and I would see, beautifully dressed people. It seemed to have an exclusively Black clientele almost going in and out of there. One time I walked by and I was trying to be, a beginning writer, and Alice Walker was having a publication party there. The kitchen door was open always on 45th Street, and I could not even come close to affording this restaurant, but I would walk as slowly as possible down the block and sort of linger and loiter right by the open kitchen door, smelling inhaling the smell of onions, peppers, celery, what's known as the holy trinity of Southern cooking, ham, beans, everything. And it was like, it smelled so good. And it was almost like just standing there smelling it, was like eating a meal. And my girlfriend and I saved up money like for 6 months. We went there one night, and it was a glamorous place full of beautiful people. And I savored every bite of that meal with that special fixity of appetite that comes with attaining something that you have aspired to. And this was my real, actually, my early mid-20s, my first real taste of Southern cooking. And it was in a very glamorous Black restaurant in Manhattan. And if you just Google Jezebel Restaurant NYC, it closed about 15 years ago. There is a great obituary of Alberta Wright, the owner, who is really considered a pioneer of Southern / soul cooking in Manhattan, and she's praised by Marcus Samuelson, the owner of one of my favorite restaurants, the Red Rooster in Harlem. And there's a picture there, and that's what I want you to look at. The picture, which is full of like palms and foliage and old lamps and antique furniture, conveys this sense of like a lush, seductive, rich, beautiful world. And I think there's some of that in, that's also part of Satterfield's mission in this documentary. And I totally appreciate it.
I totally agree with that. I mean, my son got tired of me hearing me say, look at that person. That person is amazing looking. Look at that dress. Look at the hair. Just everybody in this thing just looks amazing and is surrounded by amazing colors. And it really is this incredible visual feast in so many different ways. All right. We really are out of time. We're going to have to segue over to our second topic.
Can I ask you something? Are we going to do endorsements later?
We are going to do endorsements. So hang on to your endorsement. Right, we are, as always, going to do endorsements. So we'll take a little break. We'll come back. We'll talk about this kind of controversy-ish thing within the Heights. No, it's a real controversy. It's not ish at all. Welcome back. This is The Nose. It's a day early. Joining us is Rand Richards Cooper, a fiction writer, a contributing editor at Commonweal, and the restaurant critic for the Hartford Courant. Sean Murray is stand-up comedian, writer, and the host of Nobody Asked Sean podcast. So as we head into this next topic, I want to say in advance, one of the things that we do on The Nose is we often book the panel not knowing all of the topics we're going to talk about. They usually know the top line thing, like we knew it was going to be High on the Hog, but we often don't know the other stuff until kind of almost the 11th hour. And so we didn't know we were going to talk about this. And I already feel a little bit bad about talking about In the Heights last week without a Latinx panelist. We don't have a Latinx panelist again. But we're going to talk about this anyway. And it's also further complicated by the fact that, the two of us are white. But it's a controversy that you sort of can't step away from because it's been aired out in so many places. So just to kind of set it up, In the Heights, of course, is the film adaptation of Lin-Manuel Miranda's Broadway show that preceded Hamilton. It is a celebration of Washington Heights. It is, well, first of all, just a terrific musical. Even since last week, I've been sort of geeking out on the soundtrack a lot more, and it just grows and grows on me. But it's come in for some real controversy, because, in fact, the principals of the cast are the ones who are Latinx are, for the most part, light-skinned. And Washington Heights is a place where the predominant Latinx culture is that of the Dominican Republic, which would probably skew a little bit more towards a more darker skinned Latinx people. So this has been on people's minds since the trailer came out. People, cultural critics, particularly from the Latinx community, were beginning to worry about this, and then it's kind of blown up into a full-fledged furor, and it's been dealt with, I think, multiple times on National Public Radio this week, and we're going to talk about it now. So, Sean, I don't even know what your take is on this, but I do know that you right away said you had one. So let's hear it.
I think, some people are saying that, this is an overblown thing. And, at least a movie like this got the chance to be made, which I agree with. And I loved In the Heights. I saw it in theaters. It's my first movie back in theaters. I thought it was incredible. But I think it's a valid criticism. And it's Lin-Manuel Miranda issued an apology statement online. And I thought it was a really well done apology. But the part of the apology that a lot of people keyed in on is what he said is, we'll try to do better in the future. And these are we just wanted to get the movie made. And we kind of didn't, we just wanted to get the best people for the parts. And we didn't really focus on that. And it's like, the problem is that the discussion isn't even being had in the rooms, like with the casting directors, with the director, with the production, whoever. It's like you have to focus on like, how do we reflect the true demographic of this neighborhood, of this culture? Because it is true. Like there's tons of Dominican people who are my complexion, and I'm a pretty dark-skinned person, and darker, or somewhere around my complexion. And it's incredible not just to have the principal cast mainly be lighter skinned, because that is has been an issue in media with not only Latinx productions but Black productions. There's so many stories, people talk about it online all the time, where there's a story like a novel written, and it's like the character is described as dark skinned, and then when it's cast in Hollywood, it's someone who's like Zendaya's complexion, and she's a lovely actress and a lovely woman, I'm sure, but like we need to be able to reflect like that there are dark-skinned people that exist across Latinx cultures and Black cultures. So many times the people who are put in like positions to really succeed are lighter-skinned people. It's historical, and I think Lin-Manuel Miranda again issued a pretty good apology. But the issue is these are conversations that need to come up earlier on, because that way you avoid having to make an apology.
Right. By the way, people who are wondering about this have already seen it. Yes, Corey Hawkins, one of the actors, is Black. He plays a non-Latinx character. It doesn't really tick the box of the Dominican Republic. So before we get to Rand, I also want to say that Rita Moreno, who's got her own project coming out right now, was on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. This came up, and Rita Moreno, who I believe had to have her skin darkened, I think, for her role in West Side Story, or was darkened for her role in West Side Story. Here's her take on it.
Can't you just wait a while and leave it alone? There's a lot of people who are Puerto Riqueño, who are also from Guatemala, who are dark and who are also fair. We are all colors in Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm. And this is how it is. And it would be so nice if they hadn't come up with that and left it alone just for now. I mean, they're really attacking the wrong person.
Well, this did not go over well with the people who are already upset about this. So Rand, you and I are kind of, out on a limb here anyway. I'm not sure what two white guys really, have to say about this that can be made useful, but we're, I think, both going to give it a try. So go ahead.
Okay, well, let me try. I'll just say one thing. His apology is achingly sincere, and I think it's very well thought out. I sort of see three parts to it, so maybe I can help clarify what I take him to be apologizing for. One is a basic reality of representation issue. It's supposed to be a musical about a Dominican neighborhood in Upper Manhattan. Something like 90% of Dominicans have some substantial amount of Black ancestry. So pure realism alone would seem to require more dark-skinned actors. So part one of his apology was, he said, in trying to paint a mosaic of this community, we fell short. I'm sorry. In other words, they didn't paint the right picture. They effaced people. They changed the picture. They created invisibility. And he apologizes to people who feel unseen. But, there's more to this. In general, actors, I think, often have, they understand that acting itself is, it's the assumption of an identity that's not yours. It's an imaginative act and an imaginative projection. And a general trend of modernism in theater for a long time has been to sort of free up actors to play against type, including racial and ethnic types. But this actor's, take on identity is now running into a very high value that liberal and progressive ideology places on identity as a kind of cultural and political good that belongs to its owner, that can be and so often has been appropriated. And that's really part two of Miranda's apology. He says, I hear that without sufficient dark-skinned Afro-Latino representation, the world feels extractive of the community we wanted so much to represent with pride and joy. To me, that word extractive is doing a very large amount of work. It tips us off to the nature of the moment we find ourselves in. It's probably not a word that would have been used 5 years ago, and not even 3 years ago. And many people will see the use of that word as progress. Finally, part three, I think, of the apology. One way, I guess the way that I approach this, a white guy, is perhaps simply to say actors of color, cultural creators of color have long been systematically underrepresented in the industry. It's past time to do something about that so that there's a kind of basic job apportionment issue here, above and beyond the trickiness of the identity issue. And that's part three of what Miranda is saying, where he promises, quote, sufficient representation in the future. It's like, hey, there are jobs, there's a certain number of jobs, people should share equally in these jobs. It hasn't been historically the case. So I think I agree his apology was good in that he showed that he was sensitive to and he was aware of and doing his very best to respond supremely humanely to all these concerns. We'll see what happens in the future, but I think its apology kind of tracks out the chief points of where we are right now with this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think one thing that I take away from this is, and just, absorbing as much of the commentary on it as I could, is this is obviously, in all the ways that Sean laid out, a very, very real thing and a very, very real concern. And having spent at least a little bit of time in Washington Heights, I did have like a tiny little voice in the back of my head watching this movie going, it just doesn't really seem like anybody here looks like they're from the Dominican Republic or of Dominican ancestry, or it doesn't seem like many people do anyway, and they're all in the background. And there's a way in which I think if there were like 8 movies out right now, or 8 movies, big budget movies being released even in 2021 that dealt significantly with the Latinx experience in America, you could probably get away with this thing because it's very much Lin-Manuel Miranda's take on his growing up in this neighborhood. He's still connected to the neighborhood. I think he still lives within walking distance of most of the scenes that you see, the Washington Heights scenes you see in the movie. It's not like he's some outsider with, his own weird take on it. And that at the very beginning, the opening scene, the character of Usnavi, now played by Anthony Ramos, says something like, just like my buddy Cole Porter says, and he rhymes Cole Porter with cold water, I think, and you're sort of thinking, well, so, I think the guy who's in Washington Heights who's into Cole Porter is Lin-Manuel Miranda, and it's very much sort of his vision of his own life, and maybe he therefore, doesn't really include as much of everybody else as he should. I don't think it would be, Sean, as big a problem as it looms as I said, if there were like 8 other competing big budget projects right now where the Latinx story was being told or the Dominican story was being told in other ways.
You're absolutely right. And I think, but that's kind of the issue. It's like there's a lot of weight being put on this particular movie to be representative, and the problem with that is that it could never be totally representative. But there's not enough opportunities to tell stories where you could get the wide range of different, like Lin-Manuel Miranda's perspective and several others. It's so all the weight is being put on this one, and I think part of the reason why there's a disappointment. Even a lot of the critics of the movie, just like myself, loved the movie. But I think that part of the reason that there's a disappointment there is because Lin-Manuel Miranda is of Latinx descent. He is a person of color. So usually when something like this happens, it's just like, well, everyone who was involved in production, the producers, the director, everyone was white. So what could you expect? This like when there's finally someone like Lin-Manuel Miranda. He produced the movie, he created the play, he's in the driver's seat, so he has the ability to make those decisions. So when someone of our culture, a person of color, is put in that position, you kind of would think that they would be the person to bring these conversations up. Not that it's people fall short all the time, but it's just disappointing because he was, if anyone could do it, it's him. He's got as much power in Hollywood as someone who's as a new person in Hollywood could possibly have right now. He's, everyone loves him. So it's tough. I feel I'm genuinely sympathetic to him, but I also understand why people are like, Rita Moreno's thing about like, can't you just wait? That's the thing we've been hearing. People of color have been hearing since the very beginning. Can't you just wait? No, we can't wait. And if there were more, like you said, if there were more stories being told, absolutely, this wouldn't be as big an issue. But this is the only story being told about Washington Heights, and it looks very light-skinned.
Right. I do want to say that this movie took a long time to get made. I talked about this last week, and Lin-Manuel Miranda and the other people behind it have said, for a long time they just couldn't get money for it because the people who bankroll big movies said, look, there aren't any actors involved in this project who test well internationally. To which a lot of Latinx performers said, that's because you don't put us in movies. Yes, we don't test well internationally. Nobody's ever heard of us because you won't put us in any movies. And now you're saying we can't do this movie because nobody's ever heard of us. You created this problem, but it really was a real problem. Panther. Yeah, it really was a real problem just in terms of getting money initially. I think, as Sean is suggesting, eventually Lin-Manuel Miranda himself, he got big enough so that he could really kind of make that happen. All right, we have to stop there. Before we run out of time, we got to have some time for endorsements on the other side, so hang with us.
Our neighbors started packing up and picking up, and ever since the rents went up, it's gotten mad expensive, but we live with just enough. In the Heights, I flip the lights and start my day. There are fights and endless debts and bills to pay. In the Heights, I can survive without
All right, technical producer for today's show, as usual, Kat Pastor, doing a great job, as usual. The producer of The Nose, 99% of the time, is Jonathan McPants, and that certainly is the case today. Also doing a great job at keeping this all together. Time to make some recommendations, do some endorsements. Rand, I can tell you are champing at the bit to get going on this. So tell us what you're going to recommend.
I literally have never been as excited to make an endorsement as I am of this. Edna Lewis's 1976 book, The Taste of Country Cooking. She's one of my top favorite food writers. In fact, one of my favorite writers altogether. And she really belongs in High on the Hog. Her life she was a Black woman, and her life is a story of tremendous firsts. She grew up in rural Virginia. She was born in 1916 and grew up in a small town in rural Virginia that had been founded by her grandfather, who had been a slave. It was a tiny farming community. She left there as a teenager, went to New York City, sort of became a bohemian in Greenwich Village, and ended up becoming the first Black female chef to run major New York City restaurant kitchens, first at Cafe Nicholson and later at Gage and Tollner, the vaunted steak place in Brooklyn that just reopened. There was an article by Pete Wells about Gage and Tollner the other day, and it mentions Edna Lewis. And she was persuaded by the legendary Knopf editor, Judith Jones, who was John Updike's editor, among others, and Judith Child's editor, to take these recipes that she had and then weave a bunch of personal recollections about being a young person in backwoods Black Virginia community. And she she wove them together in a way that is overwhelmingly beautiful. It's organized, these menus, around the routines of rural life. The chapters are like a spring breakfast when the shad were running, or the morning after hog butchering breakfast. And it is like her father will be plowing the field and she's following him along, picking up sassafras roots that he turns up and bringing them back to make tea out of them. There also are these itinerant figures like the traveling hog butcher, and they butcher the hogs, a couple times a year. And then she describes they take the hog stomachs, dry them out, and blow them up as balloons and use them as Christmas tree ornaments.
All right, I'm just gonna have to stop you there. Just I want to make sure that there's some time left
the
in the show
for
Sean. Yeah, so definitely a well-recommended book. I think you sold a lot of us on it. So Sean Murray, what have you got for us?
Just sort of piggybacking off of Rand and High on the Hog. Michael Twitty has an amazing book called The Cooking Gene. He was featured in the first episode of High on the Hog. He helped. They made a stew together. It wasn't okra, but it wasn't gumbo. They made a stew together in the first episode, and Stephen Satterfield. And it's an amazing book. It's similar to High on the Hog, but it's not about like the influence on American culture. It's more about just the history of cooking in the South, in the Old South, and combined with personal stories from Michael Twitty's life. And another book, Jubilee, which is a very similar. It's less personal anecdotes, but it's another story of American. Black American Southern cooking. That book is by Jubilee by Tony Tipton Martin. Those are the two books I would recommend.
Yeah, I believe Tipton Martin is in the fourth and final episode, isn't that?
Yes, yeah. What am I? I'm an idiot.
No, you're not. So yeah. Well, those are all great endorsements. I'll just quickly say two things. One of them is that kind of I alluded to it, but I want to kind of nail it down here. Black Cowboys, Zarin Burnett III's podcast It is just terrific. We did a show with him a couple of weeks ago, and it was really fun to do. But I mean, really just story after story, and really kind of works in a way that's sort of similar to High on the Hog in the sense that it's just, these are just stories you don't know. 1/4 of the cowboys, the cowboys of the sort of fabled Wild West were black men, or in some cases women, as we find out in Black Cowboys. It's just a terrific thing, and just in that sense of kind of celebrating parts of the story that haven't been told, as we're in this kind of retelling of the American past right now. This is just one of the best examples of it. And then I will quickly say, this is the first time I think ever that our favorite author, Ben Winters, is going to have a book out. We're probably not going to do a show about it. He's just a great writer, and literally we've done a show with him about every book he's ever put out. Because Betsy Kaplan is leaving, we're probably not going to do it this time. The book's called The Quiet Boy. It's out right now. It starts out appearing to be a legal thriller, but as is so often the case with Ben Winters' books, it's really something else entirely. Although it is a legal thriller, it's also very much a family drama. It's also about race in interesting ways. But it's also, I can't really say what it really is about without kind of wrecking something about it. So, and I would also specifically say that if you like audiobooks. The audiobook of this is narrated by William Demerit, an actor and voice talent who's been on this show. He was on the show we did about audiobooks, and he did Underground Airline, which was one of Ben Winters' books. And he's really, really good at this. I mean, something about his voice and his delivery and everything like that makes it even better. So The Quiet Boy, and also Black Cowboys. And yeah, I mean, we all recommend High on the Hog. Really, I know what you're thinking. I don't like cooking shows. I don't like stuff like that. I don't either. This is the show for people who don't necessarily gravitate towards something like that. It's also the show, as Rand has illustrated, for people who care passionately about it. All right, that's it. That's the news for today. We will have some special Juneteenth programming that will run on Friday. We'll also run in our noon slot on Saturday. And then we'll be back with, I'm actually going to be off next week, but we've got some favorite shows from the past we've selected for you, and I think you're going to enjoy those too.
Talk about everything as a matter of fact. Oh yeah. Talk about Torrington, Vernon, Danbury, Waterbury, Alderberry, Woodbury, hitting on New Britain, Vernon, I already said that one, Avon, Farmington, yeah.